Hi everyone. It's a shame I couldn't speak to you on this topic in person, but that's the way things are. My name is Benjamin Felix Richardson. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Auckland. My topic for you today is From Food to Finance, the Collapse of Local Agriculture and the Rise of Residential Capitalism in Northwest Auckland. Before we get started, it's worth mentioning that my PhD is in anthropology. So my work entails interviews with developers, real estate agents, builders, horticulturalists, community advocates, and residents. It's got ethnographic field work, participant observation and photography. Also obviously desk work, like specifically right now, I'm reading legal documents and planning materials around Auckland's urban development. I'm also doing some geospatial analysis of development over time using historical aerial photography. And of course, some case studies of existing research from the perspective of international urban development. So I'll be covering in this 15-minute time section a number of things that coalesce around a single idea. I'll be starting with horticulture and property development in Kumeu-Huapai, which is a formerly rural town about 20 k's west of the Auckland CBD. I'll then go over some developer discourses surrounding urban sprawl in Auckland in general. Move out scale a little bit further nationally to discuss public shortfall and private windfall in Aotearoa. And to really kind of push the envelope here, really quickly discuss the global perspective of urban development, specifically the financial side, a wall of money that is looking to park itself somewhere and is increasingly settling on real estate. My last main point will be a return to discussing periurban agriculture in Tamaki Makaurau and reminding us why it actually matters. Like, why should we care that local horticulture is collapsing around big cities? And of course, with the conclusion, going over this conflict and possible ways we could resolve it. Okay, so Kumeu-Huapai and the surrounding area have been important horticultural areas for Auckland and the whole country for more than a century. Apples, kiwi fruit, and stone fruit have been put on trains and sent down at least as far as Christchurch for decades. But these sectors started to decline as markets were opened up following the liberalisation of the country in the 80s. They became uncompetitive against bigger operations in Auckland, say down Pukekohe, Drury, and then nationally against operations around Hawke's Bay, and of course eventually internationally. So certainly by the start of the new millennium, horticulture in Kumeu-Huapai was in a state of collapse. At the same time, however, since the new millennium, Kumeu-Huapai's property development sector has been going absolutely great. In fact, between 2014 and 2019, Kumeu-Huapai, and this is just ridiculous, but it's true, had the biggest average property value rises in the country. So it beat Queenstown and Wanaka. The average price of a house went up by 950,000 New Zealand dollars in that time. So I'm going to go over these two sides, collapse of horticulture, rise of development, for a few minutes here. So when horticulture became less competitive and it became harder to make a profit, some might say, oh, that would mean the more efficient ones in the area could survive, where else some would collapse. Well, actually, as one interviewee put it, you need a community in order to keep these things going. You need a lot of unpaid labor and a lot of sort of sharing to keep these businesses going. So when some horticulturalists sold up, other horticulturalists suddenly found out there was no one around who could lend them tools, who could come over to help out on an afternoon, who could take their kids to school if they were busy. What this meant was, once a few started selling up, it just became less and less realistic to imagine yourself continuing to grow food close to Auckland City. As one real estate agent put it, you drive up all along Huapai to Foster Road, you won't find anybody picking apples around here. Now the families are fighting over what to do with the places. And of course, the common refrain, even from one guy who owned 40 acres of horticultural production, is that just in terms of scale, the economies of scale, they could not compete with national level production. Like I said, though, on the other side of this, residential development, never been hotter. There is a downside to that. Apparently, they've been a bit of a victim of their success. where the demand for residential and commercial development is so high, it's actually getting a bit hard to find plots you can sell to people. But still, I'm not sorry for them. One boutique house builder told me he's been with the company 14 years. In that time, they've built 350 houses. 250 of those were built in the past 4 years. Someone else who bought a house building franchise in the area 5 years ago, they've built 2,000 houses in those 5 years, and the rate is only going up. And another real estate agent story, a client in the area sold his family farm for $4 million, thought he got a great deal, till he found out the buyer managed to time it right with some new zoning, managed to break it up into housing blocks and sell it for $69 million. And it's really important to understand the amount of money being made out here at the edge of the city. Zoom out a little bit further, Auckland in general. I'm sure most of you are actually quite familiar with this. It's been on the news for years now. Most people are finding that lifestyle block living is good, especially urban professionals. And for a number of reasons due to cost and complexity, developers either will not or cannot focus on building in density, building up. Instead, they prefer to build out onto flat, formerly agricultural land. For them, it's much safer financially and also just structure-wise. So for them, why wouldn't they build out? Why wouldn't they perpetuate sprawl? But of course, developers have a moral argument to protect this outward expansion. The second quote is from a legal representative for a developer who wanted to build 120 single-family homes on the Pukaki Peninsula in South Auckland. He said, every single opportunity to provide housing at whatever scale, public rental housing, affordable housing, high-density housing or suburban housing will be of value to answer this critical social and community need. I simply do not agree that insufficient justification for additional growth exists. So in this case, again, this is a very brief discussion of discourse, but the very real pressures of the housing crisis are enabling developers to say, well, why shouldn't we go out as far as we can? Why shouldn't we continue the sprawl? And again, to push my luck a bit further and discuss this on a national scale, this significant amount of money, just shocking amount of money being made at the edge of the city is kind of mirrored by a public lack of funding in almost everything. There's irrelevant stuff for development, like people out in Kumeu-Huapai, new developments are saying they don't have the money to build the infrastructure for transport and human life to accommodate these new builds. But it's across the board, healthcare, education, just, the things that make a nation function are running out of money, even as some people turn a $4 million purchase into a $69 million sale. As one resident of Kumeu-Huapai said, landowners got millions in untaxed gain, everyone else got left with the work. And to really, really embarrass myself, I'm going to go out to a global level here. So globally, you might have heard that urban populations are expected to double between the new millennium and 2030 as people leave rural areas and move to cities. What is less remarked upon, however, is that the urbanized land area is going to triple in that same time. So per capita, per person, we're using up more land as we urbanize. And one reason for this, as pointed out by Professor David Harvey, is that this is financially driven. There is a lot of money flowing around right now. And in these as they say, in these uncertain times, it needs to go somewhere to get a return. And real estate has become a really great absorption mechanism. This applies to New Zealand. There is a reason why house prices have shot up so fast the last couple of years, even as immigration has been stalled. Another reason for this, which is also financially related in New Zealand, is that if you're a developer, you go to the bank and you say, I want to build something. I want to build a residential development. They want to see at least a 20% profit margin. And interviews by Professor Lawrence Murphy on this uncovered the fact that if you have this figure, 20% profit margin in mind, and you're trying to build apartments, you might basically have to pre-sell most of them before you even get approval. However, building on flat agricultural land, building big two-story houses with their own lifestyle block each, much less risky. So economically, it only makes sense to accelerate the sprawl. Now, like I said, I'm going to briefly attempt to defend peri-urban agriculture as a useful part of human society. Brinkley over in California a couple of years ago pointed out that it's not just the soil in a place that makes an area good for agriculture, as much as soils have been an important area of study the last few years on this. Being close to a city gives you a unique access to labor markets, commercial inputs and outputs, and also people you can sell stuff to without having to travel 400 kilometers across the country in order to sell it at a large warehouse. And this isn't a new concept. 4 decades ago, Professor Warren Moran, who was working in Auckland, found that farming and horticulture operations in Auckland became more productive the closer they are to the city. It's kind of the opposite of how many people imagine economic efficiency. So then, well, how do we resolve this? I mean, I'm just one student, but one council member I spoke to put it like this: there's a housing crisis, sure, but most people are profiting from it immensely. In this country, I think by far the majority of families are still homeowners, even though that number's going down. So the rapid increase in demand for housing is in some ways quite good for a lot of people, a lot of voting people. And for the younger people watching this, you might want to ask your parents and grandparents about how they imagine themselves retiring, because most landowners I've spoken to see this rapid appreciation in house prices as the only way to retire with dignity in a country that, as I mentioned, has a high cost of living and really some mounting problems in the healthcare and social safety systems. So therefore, if we want to preserve less competitive land uses like agriculture close to cities, we have to confront this inequality, this desperation, and of course the millions of dollars being made as a factor to eliminate or at least work with. So what to take home from all of this? 3 points. So urban development is accelerating at a greater pace than the actual increase in urban population because, partially at least, finance capital needs a place to go, especially in these quote unquote uncertain times. Agricultural production close to cities offers unique benefits not found in large-scale operations in remote rural areas and are therefore worth preserving. And in order to ensure this, in order to ensure the existence of communities that can do agricultural work very close to cities, we have to confront the fact that the financialization of land and housing is deeply linked to increasing levels of inequality and precarity in this country and across the world. And if you have to squish this all into one sentence, which you have to take home, if you just the rest of this is entirely pointless, this means, especially as socially, economically, and environmentally, this world starts to get a lot messier, we have to talk about how development is being financed by banks and about whether all that money that's being made from selling farmland for housing should remain in private hands untaxed, and whether there is a need for public funding of things from this. Here are my references. Thank you very much, and I really hope we all have a good summer.